Hi, it's Dr. Asatar Bear here with you today to talk about the limitations and distortions of GDP as a measure of the economy. So in a previous video, we talked about how the GDP statistic is the total value of all new finished goods and services produced in a domestic economy in a given year, about how it's constructed so that there's no double counting. It's only new finished goods. It measures a domestic economy in its geographical borders. And again, it only looks at the market goods and services, okay, the total market value of all the new finished goods and services. So the US GDP in 2019 was $21.729 trillion. GDP is the king of economic statistics. It's the number one economic statistic. Anybody who's assessing an economy's growth or development or health, anytime anybody says anything pretty much about the economy, an economy, they're going to look at its GDP. They might also look at inflation, they might look at unemployment, but these are the big three statistics, and of the big three, the GDP is the absolute number one statistic. So we have to understand it, and in particular, we have to look at what are its limitations, or does it have distortions? Does it have ways that it actually obscures our understanding of the economy? Every statistic has things like these. It has things that it's good at measuring, things that it reveals, and things that it doesn't do a good job measuring. Okay, so here's the problem, right? GDP has both limitations and distortions. The limitations are things that economic activities that are not measured by GDP. Okay, and then distortions are economic activities that are measured, but that actually are negatives to society. Okay, they decrease social well-being, but they add to GDP, and that creates a kind of a conflict within the measure. Okay, so first thing, let's talk about the limitations, right? GDP simply does not measure all economic activity. All right, so if this light blue area represents the total of all economic activity, that is all production and consumption, GDP is only a subset of that, okay? It's only a fraction of that. Why is that? Well, one reason is that GDP does not measure any non-market production, okay? So what that means is when goods and services are produced but are not sold in markets. So one of the big ones here is called household production, HHP, and this includes activities such as cooking, cleaning, childcare, kind of maintenance and repair. This is a pretty big item in the United States. There's a lot of economic production that goes on. And this is like any other kind of economic production. That is, you take raw materials and you add value to them with labor and produce a good or service that's higher value than what you started with. All right, just like anything else. Okay, so like we take something like cleaning. Okay, cleaning, you got to have some products, you got to have some tools to work with. You use cleaning products, some of that gets used up in the process. You also use tools and equipment which depreciate during that process, but then you add to that and produce a service which is of greater value than the raw materials and equipment that went into it. All right? Now, if we add up all these activities, we don't have a great measure of this because it's not part of GDP. There's not government statistics on this. But those who have looked at this, has been studied for a long time, estimate that the total household production in GDP is about 80% of GDP, about 16 or 17 trillion dollars, okay? Now the same thing could be said for volunteer labor, right? People volunteer many millions of hours to nonprofits or other organizations. That labor also does not count in GDP because we're only counting market production. This is not a market, right? If you volunteer, you're essentially giving your labor to somebody or organization, right? That's not going to be counted as part of GDP. And this is somewhere between perhaps $200 to $400 billion a year. All right, so part of the limitation. GDP also does not measure the informal sector. All right, so informal sector is where goods and services are produced and they're sold in markets, but it's not reported. Okay, so for example, crime, businesses which do not report their income or their employees, this is illegal, but it's pretty common. It's called being paid under the table. If you get paid in cash, probably your employer is not reporting that they have an employee in order to avoid taxes. United States, this is estimated to be about 10% of GDP. In developed economies, the informal sector tends to be smaller. In other places in the world, the informal sector is a lot larger. So, for example, in India, the informal sector is probably over 50% of GDP. It's said that 85% of workers work in the informal sector. So it's a lot larger in some economies than others, right? Even at 10%, that's $2 trillion or $2.1 trillion. So it's a fairly significant $2 trillion is a lot of money, right? So if we go back to our graph, right, again, if this represents the total economic activity, GDP is only a subset, okay? GDP 21.7 trillion. The total would include, of course, all the GDP, all that counted part. It would also include all of the household production, right, about $17 trillion. It would also include this volunteer labor, and it would include anything in the informal sector as well, all right? So we add that up and we get somewhere over $40 trillion, right? The GDP is only counting maybe about half of the total economic activity. That's a problem. It also means that the GDP is going to inaccurately measure growth if non-market production becomes market production. Okay, so for example, let's say that women enter the workforce and do less of the stuff that they did before, right? The work in the household is traditionally women's work, right? Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. That's the history, that's the tradition, right? This is a highly gendered form of labor, right? In the last 60 years in United States history, women have entered the workforce in increasing numbers, and that means they've done less of the household production than they were doing before, right? The household surveys indicate this. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence. There's plenty of data on this. What do households do? Because they still need these services. They need these goods and services, right? Well, they replace them with market goods and services. Okay, so rather than cooking as much, some of those meals get replaced with takeout or some kind of meal that is, there's so many different ways of doing this these days, right? Like you have meals that are more prepared, right? You can anyway, I'm not going to go into all the details of this, right? But cleaning services, a high amount of growth in that, right? Childcare, obviously, very fast growing market. Okay, so this is replacing the unpaid non-market household production with market goods and services, and you see what kind of problem this causes, right? This takes stuff that was in the light blue and moves it into the dark blue. That's not real growth, right? Real growth would be this entire light blue shape would have to grow, right? That's what growth is. If this grows and this one gets smaller, that is, the dark one grows within that, that's going to look like growth from the perspective of GDP, but it's not real growth, right? That's fake growth, and that's one of the problems that goes in with this limitation. All right. So now GDP doesn't just have limitations, right? It also has distortions, and these are economic activities which decrease social well-being, like I said, but they actually add to GDP. This is in a way a more serious kind of issue, right? The first one is just things that aren't being measured, but this is like we're measuring the wrong thing in the wrong way. All right, so for example, right, the GDP distorts our understanding by not counting any kind of assets. So GDP measures economic income, but not changes in assets. Now, what do we mean by changes in assets? Okay, well, there's two things, right? We can look at physical capital, that's wealth created by humans, right? That by artificial, right? Where humans produce durable goods, right? The most durable goods that we produce are things like roads and bridges and stuff like this, right? Infrastructure. But there's also natural resources, right? That which is created by nature. These are the assets of planet Earth, right? Broadly speaking, okay? GDP does not measure any changes in these assets. That is, it's a pure income measure. that means that economic activity which reduces an asset's value will increase GDP. All right, and that's a pretty serious thing because GDP is going to go up, but the real wealth goes down in this situation. I mean, just to give an example, okay, a imagine a company borrows $1 million and then spends it, right? The way that statistics work for businesses is it makes it very difficult for a company to get away with this because investors would look at this and say, oh well, you just increased your indebtedness, so that's not real money. You borrowed money and spent it, so you increased your liabilities, and that income that you generate isn't real, right? Um, but for GDP doesn't is not tracked that way. It's very strange, right? Here's what this means. Okay, activities which destroy assets and then rebuild them, such as what happens typically in wars and natural disasters, this will increase GDP, but it makes society worse off. Okay, the same is true for any debt-funded spending that will increase GDP, but there's no negative. There's no sense of, well, society just increased its liabilities and those have to stand against the assets. Okay, so GDP doesn't count assets or liabilities, right? This leads to some pretty strange things. Okay, so look, war destroys wealth. All right, I can't be any clearer about this. Right, that's what war is. War is the destruction of land, labor, and capital. Right, it should not increase GDP, and yet we definitely have the understanding that war increases GDP because what we often see in the aftermath of a war is that the infrastructure that was destroyed is rebuilt. So there's no negative for the destruction, but there is a positive, right? The roads and the bridges and the buildings and all this wealth that has been destroyed by warfare gets rebuilt, and that rebuilding that counts, right? That's new goods and services produced in that year. That increases GDP. That's a problem for understanding. That's a huge distortion. The other huge distortion, of course, is that GDP statistics, in their structure, it rewards environmental destruction, right? The forests and the oceans and all of our natural resources have essentially no value until they are cut down, until they are turned into commodities, right? And this is a huge distortion where we don't want to incentivize this. We want to regard it as, okay, well, this forest has a value. If we deplete it, then that's a negative, right? We can't get a positive out of a negative. We have to. This is what accounting is all about, right? GDP is national income accounting. You should have to follow the same rules that normal companies follow, right? Um, all right, so GDP also counts activities which lower society's well-being. So, like I said, cutting down a forest raises GDP. An oil spill, if you spend money to clean it up, that's going to raise GDP. Um, Activities which destroy health often raise GDP. So, cigarettes, alcohol, etc. You know, the cigarette industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that raises GDP. Right? There's no negative for destroying people's health. Um, Same thing for healthcare expenses, right? If you have a lengthy battle with cancer, maybe even you die, right? So long as you receive treatment for that, that's all going to raise GDP. That's all services, right? But this is not necessarily increasing society's well-being, okay? Now this last one's a tricky one, right? Because if you have an illness, you'd rather have treatment than not have treatment, right? All right, so the other problem here is that GDP ignores a lot of social and economic effects, which obviously lower the well-being in society. All right, so things like crime or the breakdown of family structures or just stress, right? Deterioration of mental health, the loss of people's leisure time, the time that's spent just commuting, time sitting in traffic, um, things like racism or economic inequality, right? GDP doesn't consider any of this stuff. And we know, right, social scientists have studied all of these things. They know that they make people less happy. Um, so that's odd, right? That when our primary measure of economic progress is so at odds with our general understanding of what is society's well-being. And there's difficulties and complications with trying to measure society's well-being, but there's difficulties and complications with trying to measure anything, right? Just because something's in dollars, that doesn't actually make it easier to measure, because there's always these other factors, right? What the problem with GDP is, it just looks at things that are measured in dollars and doesn't look at things that are equally important but aren't so easy to measure. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? We should still try. Okay, there are alternative measures of the economy that try to address the limitations and distortions of GDP in some way, because GDP statistics have been around since the late 1940s. We've had decades to think about them, think about the problems, think about the limitations, and try to address those. All right, so here's a measure called the Human Development Index. It's the HDI. And this takes account of things like life expectancy, education, so forth, in addition to GDP. There's another one called the Measure of Economic Welfare, which is good. That takes into account the value of leisure time, unpaid work, environmental damage. There's the Genuine Progress Indicator, that's the GPI. This takes into account many additional variables. I like this one, so I'm going to take a look at this one in more detail. But basically, all of these measures are starting with GDP and trying to modify it. Okay, so let's take a look at the GPI here. They take GDP and then they adjust it, okay, based on a number of different variables. Some are positive and some are negative. Okay, so we have here social variables, right? They try to take into account the value of infrastructure, okay? So what they call the services of highways and streets, the value of infrastructure in our lives, the value of higher education, okay? With the understanding that more education, that tends to make people happier, right? The value of these unpaid hours of volunteer work, like I mentioned before, right? Or domestic labor, what I call household production. These should all be positives, and they are positives in this index, okay? Then there's some that are negative social indicators, okay? So the time spent commuting, that's a negative. Car accidents, right? That's a negative. The loss of leisure time, all right? Personal pollution abatement, right? Meaning what we do to try to reduce pollution in our own personal lives, that's a negative to us, right? That's time that we spend, trying to do what we can to help the environment. Family breakdown, crime, these are all negatives, okay? Economics, we've got some positives in here, so increases in personal expenditure, right, seen as positive. Adjusted personal consumption, the services that come from the durables, okay, so consumer durables, this means all of the goods that we have that last a long time, right? They provide us with services, okay? So think of the biggest example in our lives is probably like our house or a car, right? So a house is only adds to GDP in the year that it was built, right? The rest of its lifetime, right? If a house lasts 100 years, it's basically like that doesn't count at all, right? It only counts when you spend money to maintain it. But it still provides you with a service, right? You can live in that house even though it was built 50 years ago or whatever. You're living in it today. That's a service which is providing to you, right? So they're trying to take account, like I said, of the value of assets, right? Things like net capital investment. And then they're trying to take out some of the negatives, okay? So they have a negative entry for income inequality. But this is a negative for society, okay? The cost of maintaining all of these consumer durables, they take that out. Underemployment. This means people who would like to be working more hours but can't find employment. Like example, let's say you're working 20 hours a week, but you'd like to be working 40, you just can't find a full-time job. Part-time job is all you could find. You are considered underemployed, right? So this is a negative in society, right? Some of your leisure is unwanted, right? Okay, so, and then they have a bunch of negatives here to adjust for environmental variables. Notice there's no positives in this column, okay? These are all negatives. So they've got an entry here for non-renewable resource depletion, for ozone depletion, for climate change, for net loss of forest cover. Notice this is net, okay? So you plant trees, it's like the trees planted minus the trees cut down, right? for the loss of farmland. Now, all of these things are very strongly negative, by the way, right? In contemporary society, we look at the last 50 years, all of these things are very strongly net negatives. So farmlands, wetlands, noise pollution, air pollution, water pollution. They're suggesting we ought to make an adjustment for all these things. Okay. Now here's the thing: if we do that, I think they've got a good point here, right? If we do that, what we find is there's a big difference in terms of if we just look at the unadjusted GDP. Okay, this is for the period from 1950 to 2004 in here, right? So if we just look at the unadjusted GDP, what we find is there's a lot of increase here, right? This is GDP per capita, okay, and so adjusted by the size of the population, we can see that GDP per capita has increased substantially during this period, right? It's about 3.5 times higher than it was in 1950, all right, on a per capita basis. So meaning we're 3.5 times richer per person in the United States than we were just a few decades before. That's amazing, right? But some of this has come at the expense of the environment and the various different social costs that have come with that. Okay, so we adjust that. We find the genuine progress indicator, it's a lot flatter during this period. Look at this. So from the period from 1974 to 2004, rather than continuing to increase as the GDP does, those negatives begin to really kick in, right? So we do see some growth here, but then we see a kind of flatness, right? And this is a period where economic inequality increases, where environmental destruction continues, and so forth, right? So it makes a pretty big difference what measure we use, right? If we take account of these other factors, we have a very different understanding of what is progress, right? Now this is difficult, this is abstract, because our measure, our statistic, is like all we have, right? We can't look around, like we can't pick up the economy and examine it. We can't be like, what's going on with this, right? There is no place that we can go to see the entire economy. It's an abstraction to us, right? We have to use statistics. We have to use graphs, right? We can't see the entire thing. We develop a picture of it by looking at many different measures, right? So what I'm suggesting in this section is that the GDP, while it tells us certain things, and we definitely want to look at it, right? We want to study it. It's, again, one of our main macroeconomic statistics. It also hides things. It obscures things. It gives us a wrong idea about a lot of things as well, right? So there's a case to be made that we should replace the measure with another measure. But we can't so easily do that on our own, right? The reason when we have conversations together about the economy, how's the economy doing, right? We have to kind of all be on the same page, right? So this is something that the entire society needs to update, needs to adjust, right? Like I could go ahead and use the GPI, but if I have to explain everything about it before I use it, that has less utility, right? We want to all be on the same page with our indicator. We want to be using the same statistics so that we can have a genuine conversation about what's going on in the economy. All right, so that's my lecture. Thank you very much.